Long before Tikal raised its famous temples above the jungle, another Maya city had already learned how to move mountains. In northern Guatemala, beneath a canopy so dense that stone monuments can look like natural hills, El Mirador became the center of one of the most astonishing landscapes in the ancient Americas. Its builders raised enormous platforms, cut reservoirs into a land with no permanent rivers, and linked settlements with elevated causeways that crossed seasonal wetlands. Then, near the end of the late Preclassic period, the system suffered a dramatic demographic collapse. The disturbing question is not how people without metal tools or draft animals built something so large. It is what happens when a society becomes powerful enough to remake its environment, but not powerful enough to escape the consequences. For much of the 20th century, the standard picture of early Maya civilization was relatively modest. Monumental cities, divine kingship, sophisticated infrastructure, and large political systems were associated mainly with the Classic period, beginning around AD 250. El Mirador helped break that picture apart. Archaeologists found that much of its monumental core was centuries older. The city had become a dominant center during the middle and late Preclassic periods, and by roughly the last few centuries before Christ, construction was taking place on a scale that once seemed impossible for such an early date. Today, LiDAR makes that scale harder to ignore. Laser pulses fired from aircraft can penetrate gaps in the forest canopy and map variations in the ground below. Across the wider Mirador-Calakmul karst basin, researchers have identified hundreds of ancient settlement clusters. Many were connected, directly or indirectly, by an extraordinary network of raised causeways. More than 177 kilometers of Preclassic causeways have been documented in recent analysis. This was not a lonely ceremonial center surrounded by empty jungle. It was a dense human landscape. At El Mirador itself, the architecture becomes almost absurd in scale. The Danta complex rises through 3 enormous platforms crowned by a triadic group. Current estimates place the complex at roughly 72 meters high, with millions of cubic meters of construction fill. Archaeologists still debate measurements and how best to compare ancient monuments, but the important point is beyond dispute. This project required an extraordinary concentration of labor. Every basket of fill had to be moved by people. Every block had to be quarried and worked with the technologies available to the Maya. There were no oxen pulling stone wagons through the forest. There were no iron chisels. The wheel was not used here as a practical transport system. Monumental construction on this scale therefore represents more than engineering. It represents organization. Planners, farmers, quarry workers, plaster makers, water managers, specialists, and authorities capable of coordinating them. One estimate for the nearby Tigre complex calculated millions of person-days of labor just for its basic construction. Whether those workers served willingly, through obligation, through religious devotion, or through forms of political coercion that archaeology cannot fully recover, the result is the same. Someone could mobilize society on a massive scale, and the roads show that this power reached beyond a single plaza. The Maya called raised roads Sakbeob. At El Mirador, major causeways ran across wet lowlands toward other centers, such as Nakbe and Tintal. Some were tens of meters wide and elevated several meters above surrounding terrain. In the rainy season, when low areas became difficult to cross, these engineered corridors kept movement possible. People, food, stone, goods, and information could travel through a connected landscape. It is tempting to call this an empire. That word makes a clean headline. The evidence is more interesting than the headline. Researchers studying the basin argue that the hierarchy of settlements, repeated architectural forms, infrastructure, and causeway network point toward unusually strong political, economic, and ideological integration. They have proposed an early kingdom or state-like system centered on El Mirador. But archaeology cannot hand us a surviving constitution. We do not know that every community answered to one ruler in the way a Roman province answered to Rome. What we can say is that the old image of scattered, simple villages no longer fits. The same landscape that displayed this power also imposed a brutal limit. Northern Petén has pronounced wet and dry seasons. Much of the Mirador region is covered by bajos, low-lying seasonal wetlands. Reliable water and productive soil had to be managed carefully. El Mirador's inhabitants did exactly that. They modified wetlands, constructed terraces and raised fields, and developed systems for capturing and storing rainwater. At El Mirador, sunken spaces were converted into reservoirs. Dams and water control features turned seasonal rainfall into a resource that could support a large population through the dry months. This was not a civilization passively waiting for nature to provide. It was actively redesigning the landscape. For generations, that strategy worked. Then the costs of scale began to accumulate. The monuments of El Mirador were not left as bare piles of limestone. Maya builders used enormous quantities of lime-based mortar and stucco. Producing lime requires heat. Heat requires fuel. Construction also required stone, fill, labor, and repeated resurfacing of plazas and buildings. Archaeological research in the basin has documented extraordinarily thick sequences of plaster floors in some places, evidence of sustained investment in monumental display. That investment mattered because the environment was not infinitely forgiving. Sediment studies around the basin show serious erosion during the Preclassic period. Excavations in bajos near major sites have found old organic soils buried beneath large deposits of clay. In some locations near El Mirador, researchers documented meters of sediment above what appears to have been an earlier dark, productive surface. Now imagine the system from inside it. You are a farmer living beneath monuments that proclaim stability. The reservoirs still hold water. The causeways still carry workers. Priests still perform ceremonies above plazas coated in pale stucco. But each construction program demands more fuel and more labor. Each cleared slope becomes more vulnerable to tropical rain. Soil moves downhill. Sediment collects where productive wetland muck once supported cultivation. Nothing has to fail in one dramatic night. That is what makes the danger harder to see. The ecological explanation for El Mirador's decline is compelling, but it is not a solved murder case. Researchers have linked resource consumption, lime production, erosion, and damage to agricultural systems with the demographic collapse. Climate variability, political disruption, competition, and other pressures may also have contributed. The responsible conclusion is not that vanity alone killed El Mirador. It is that a highly organized society appears to have pushed an already demanding landscape toward conditions that made its system increasingly difficult to sustain. And somewhere between roughly AD 150 and 250, the machinery stopped working at its former scale. Major construction and occupation declined dramatically across much of the Mirador basin. El Mirador was not erased in a single apocalyptic event, and it was not abandoned forever. Centuries later, smaller groups returned and lived among the ruins. But the immense pre-classic concentration of population and labor never recovered. The white roads did not disappear. They simply stopped carrying the world for which they had been built. That image is more unsettling than a battlefield. An invading army leaves weapons, burned buildings, mass graves, victory inscriptions. At El Mirador, the end appears more complicated. A political and economic system capable of organizing huge public works lost the ability to sustain the density that had made those works possible. The monuments remained standing after the networks around them weakened. Power had become architecture. Architecture survived. Power did not. But there is another trap in this story. It would be easy to draw a straight line from the fall of El Mirador to the later wars of Tikal and Calakmul and claim that one disaster created the next. The evidence does not allow that. The classic Maya world developed over the following centuries through different dynasties, alliances, migrations, religious traditions, and regional political systems. El Mirador did not simply mutate into Tikal, yet the contrast is revealing. By the classic period, the Maya lowlands were dominated not by one uncontested superstate, but by multiple kingdoms competing for influence. Tikal became one of the great powers. The Khanal dynasty, later associated with Calakmul, built a rival network of allies and subordinate rulers. Their struggle became one of the defining geopolitical contests of the classic Maya world. This was not modern warfare with fixed national borders. Dynasties fought through alliances, marriage, raids, captures, ritual humiliation, and the control of strategically important cities. Smaller kingdoms could switch sides. A victory hundreds of miles away could alter the balance of power without permanently annexing every field between the two capitals. In AD 562, Tikal suffered a devastating defeat involving the Canal sphere and Caracol. For more than a century afterward, Tikal's royal monument building entered the famous hiatus. But Tikal was not dead. In AD 695, its ruler, Jasa Chankawil I, defeated the Canal king Yuknum Yichak Kak, dramatically reversing the balance. This is where Maya history becomes dangerous for simple stories. El Mirador shows that early Maya political organization was more sophisticated than scholars once assumed. Tikal and Calakmul show that sophisticated political systems did not evolve toward permanent unity. Complexity could produce cooperation, integration, rivalry, and war at the same time. And centuries after El Mirador's great decline, many major cities of the southern lowlands faced another crisis. The terminal classic collapse, concentrated in the 8th and 9th centuries in many southern regions, was not the extinction of the Maya. Maya communities survived, adapted, migrated, and continued building cities elsewhere. Millions of Maya people are alive today. What collapsed were particular dynastic systems and urban centers. Again, there was no single killer. Evidence points to interacting pressures that varied from place to place. Severe drought episodes, warfare, political fragmentation, population stress, disruption of exchange, and environmental degradation. Some cities endured longer than others. Some populations moved. Some political systems disappeared while Maya culture continued. That distinction matters because the Maya vanished is one of the most persistent myths in popular history. They did not vanish. Rulers vanished. Courts vanished. Monument programs stopped. Great plazas emptied. The people adapted to a world in which the old centers could no longer command what they once had. That may be the real warning buried at El Mirador. Civilizations do not need to disappear for their systems to fail. Imagine standing on Danta near the end of its age of dominance. From high above the canopy, the civilization below must have looked permanent. Causeways stretched toward allied settlements. Reservoirs captured water. Ceremonies tied rulers to gods and ancestors. Generations had poured their labor into structures designed to outlive them. They succeeded. The structures did outlive them. That is the cruelest part. When modern archaeologists arrived, the pyramids were still there beneath the forest. The political certainty that created them was gone. The roads remained, but the traffic had vanished. The reservoirs remained, but the population that depended on them had dispersed. Monumental permanence had hidden systemic fragility. The forest did not preserve a story of primitive people who failed to master nature. It preserved the opposite, a story of people who mastered their landscape with remarkable skill at enormous scale for centuries. Their engineering delayed limits, redirected limits, and transformed limits. It could not abolish them. That is why El Mirador still feels modern. Not because ancient Maya society was a miniature version of ours. It was not. We have different technologies, energy systems, institutions, and global networks. Easy comparisons can turn history into propaganda. But one pattern deserves attention. The more complex a society becomes, the more invisible its dependencies can feel to the people living inside it. Food arrives because a chain works. Water arrives because a system works. Trade flows because routes stay open. Authority appears permanent because institutions survived yesterday, until several pressures arrive together. Then the same complexity that created extraordinary power can transmit failure from one part of the system to another. El Mirador's builders were not foolish. They were among the most ambitious engineers and organizers in the ancient Americas. That is exactly why their story matters. Collapse is not reserved for societies that lack intelligence. It can happen when intelligent people solve immediate problems so successfully that they increase the scale of the next problem. Today, the ruins stand inside a forest threatened in the wider region by looting, illegal logging, settlement, ranching, and trafficking networks. The jungle that once concealed El Mirador now protects an archaeological record that is still incomplete. Every excavation can change what we think we know. Every new LiDAR survey can reveal another road, platform, reservoir, or settlement beneath the canopy. So the final mystery is not whether El Mirador was too advanced for its time. That phrase misunderstands history. The mystery is how a society powerful enough to reorganize an entire landscape reached a point where its greatest strengths could no longer protect it from accumulating stress. Was the fatal weakness environmental pressure, political instability, competition for resources, climate, or some combination that crossed a threshold no ruler could reverse? Tell us which factor you think mattered most in the comments. Subscribe to the History Ledger and follow us into the next civilization whose monuments survived the system that built them. The stones endure. The ledger remembers what power forgets.